This is a re-recording of a talk given at Movement Day NYC in October of 2019. Such a pleasure to be with you here at Movement Day. What a tremendous time, and thank you to movement.org, Lead NYC, and Times Square Church for hosting. By way of introduction, I help run the Pinetops Foundation, which is our modest family foundation based in the Pacific Northwest. We recently published a report called The Great Opportunity, looking at the future of the church in America. I won't go through the full report, but did want to use some of the findings to set context today. What we found was the largest gospel opportunity in American history. And if we move quickly, we can help tens of millions of young people know Jesus in the next 30 years. Based on significant research, we estimate that about 42 million young people who were raised in families that would say they are Christian will say that they are not as adults. And if we can return retention and evangelism rates to what we saw in the 1990s, we think that number drops to 20 million, which means over 22 million young people who would otherwise walk away from Jesus will know him. That's more than every revival in American history combined. And there is incredible urgency to this moment. We are at peak switching. The largest generation in American history is the millennial generation, only to be surpassed by Gen Z. Statistically, 96% decide on their faith affiliation before 35. The oldest millennial is now 39, and the oldest Gen Z is 19. Right now is the overlap of the switching window for the two largest generations and will continue for about another 15 years. This is peak switching. We do not have decades to reach these friends. By then, it will be too late for most. And once it happens, it is much harder to swing back. The highest retention of any group is the unaffiliated, 90%. Put differently, statistically, if someone walks away from Jesus in America, 9 out of 10 times their children will never know Jesus as well. The moment is now. We cannot wait. We cannot delay. Last year, I gave an overview of this report, and so if you aren't familiar, please go to the website and download it for free. Today, I'm here to briefly unpack 2 ways that we as church leaders can respond to this moment. And let me start with the statement that will make sure I never get another speaking slot at Movement Day. I believe the word revival has at times done real damage to the American church. And by the word revival, I mean how we sometimes use revival in modern American Christianity that creates a false passivity. I'm talking about the revival that we've been hearing is just around the corner since the 1970s, while our young people stream out of our churches. I'm talking about the word revival that reduces God to a magical genie in a bottle, a mystical force that appears unannounced like Aslan and will somehow cause millions to follow Jesus. I'm talking about the word revival that acts as if we're passive observers of God's redemptive work in creation. It is heartbreaking that a word that should mean life and power has at times created an unresponsiveness to God's mission. That is not scripture, not even at Pentecost, and not the pattern that we see God moving in church history. Revival is not a mystical, magical thing. So what is it? Most of what we now call revival was God moving through the church's prayer, sustained effort, and thoughtful strategy, grounded in orthodox theology. Let me say that again. Revival is God moving through the church's prayer, sustained effort, and thoughtful strategy, grounded in orthodox theology. So if we want to actually see revival, we must stop and say, is what we're doing bearing fruit? Empirically, at a national level, the answer is no, or at least not what it should be. Let us examine ourselves as Paul encourages us to, starting with how we engage with young people. So let me tell you a story about revival in America from the First Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards is one of the most famous preachers in our country's history, however conflicted we may feel about his evolving views on racial equality. At 26, he was starting his career as a struggling first-time senior pastor. He was coming off a 3-year period of depression, was chronically ill, recently married, and his grandfather, who was the senior pastor of the church, had just passed away. In the midst of all his personal struggles, Edwards gets the pulpit. He felt inadequate, a failure, impotent in front of his congregation. Calling his parishioners sermon-proof, he decried that just after my grandfather's death, it seemed to be a time of extraordinary dullness in religion. Licentiousness greatly prevailed among the youth of the town. For nearly 6 years, he preached specifically at young people, the teenagers and early 20s of his congregation. Not the wealthy parishioners, not the town fathers, the young people, for 6 years. By 1733, something was changing. As Marsden writes, Edwards began to notice that his congregation's young people had adopted a new flexibleness in their attitudes towards his preaching. Edwards began encouraging dismayed young people to organize into small group meetings. In 1734, the revival was in full swing. Hundreds of young people dedicated their lives to Christ, and as Kidd describes, what had begun as a movement of God among young people became universal, and everyone, young and old, seemed to talk only of Jesus. Those young people went out from Edwards Church and impacted nearby towns. Within another year, dozens of other communities were seeing similar effects, and we see the beginnings of the Great Awakening. You understand, Edwards said his top priority was the spiritual health of his young people. He would not let that go. He poured his teaching, his outreach, and pastoral care for years into a group that couldn't tithe much, wasn't on his elder board, and were mostly yawning at him. But he knew that was the need, and he invested. Who among us would preach specifically to young people in our churches for 6 straight years to see them follow Jesus with passion? How often do we prioritize youth discipleship as one of the core missions of the church? Is the formation of young people a top priority for the senior leaders and not outsourced to the least experienced staff member during an hour on Friday night? Where our treasure is, so will our heart be. And would we say that of our youth? The largest, deepest study on youth and religion in America ever conducted interviewed religious and non-religious teenagers and found out of the hundreds interviewed, the only ones who could explain with any rigor their faith were the Mormon youth. Not a single Baptist, evangelical, Presbyterian, charismatic, or Catholic. Not one. I think the reality is better than that, but that is a stunning statistic. Not one. Do you know why the Mormon Church is able to have higher retention rates? Because they have to. The prevailing culture said that their faith was not acceptable, so they had to create the practices that would encourage young people to remain with their faith despite American cultural pressures. And the patterns they found were, in many cases, the historic pattern of the true church. So I ask again, why do we long for a theoretical revival when the greatest revival opportunity is in front of us and we have not done the very things that would bring about the change? Have we taught the sermons explaining what it means to walk in fellowship with Jesus as a young person? Have we challenged ourselves and every mature member of our church to care for and disciple a youth personally? Have we called and walked alongside young people in mission with Jesus? Is this a top priority for our church? There have been so many excellent books written about what is needed for our youth. So many conferences, so many talks, so many examples. And yet, in so many cases, our churches and ministries have not substantially changed from what we used when the church and culture were very different. We all sit still and hope for revival as if it were manna from heaven. Now, let me take a different example, church planning. Us and others did the math and found that we need to triple the number of churches planted annually in America right now to meet the need in front of us. When we talk with pastors, ministry leaders, and church planning experts, I've heard some people say, that's a nice sentiment, but not realistic. It's too expensive. We can't find a building. We don't have enough trained, talented people. Maybe in 20 years when we get the flywheel going. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been waiting for that flywheel my entire adult life. And let me explain why these excuses, though understandable, are prime examples of why when we don't know history, we are doomed to repeat its mistakes. The United States, at the start of the Second Great Awakening in the beginning of the 1800s, had very low church attendance, much lower than today. There was little to no church presence in the new frontier cities where young people were headed for economic opportunity. It's been called the lowest point of Christianity in America. Established, dominant denominations could not keep up with the need for new churches because they could not train pastors quickly enough in seminaries. And coming out of a seminary, those pastors expected churches with stained glass and good salaries. Enter the disruptors, the Methodists and Baptists. They changed the model with low-cost church economics, drawing their leaders from the communities in which they operated so that they knew them, were connected and contextual. They scaled with circuit riders, small groups, and bivocational pastors. They met where they could find a room. What we call the Second Great Awakening now was frankly a 50-year process of Methodists and Baptists actively planting churches, and those churches transforming those communities. This is a graph of the churches planted per capita in the United States over the last 200 years. Of course, there were tremendous moments where God's presence richly manifested himself in powerful ways. But let me be clear. The hard work that drew people to God were thousands of faithful missionaries and pastors reaching every town and settlement in America. The rest is history. They became the two largest denominations in America. And now, on the other side of that growth, we all too often think about church planting in many ways like the incumbent denominations did 200 years ago. But you say, wait, that's too high a bar. Those were dominant groups with access to privilege and resources. Fine, let me tell you another story. The American Methodist Episcopal Church was a small denomination at the end of the Civil War. It had just 20,000 members in a world where every structure and incentive for growth were stacked against them. The same could be said of various strands of African American Baptist traditions. They had to evangelize and recruit pastors from communities where Scripture had been used as a justification for their enslavement. These communities had limited education, almost no capital, and institutional structures designed to prevent access to resources of any kind. What they did have was utter commitment to God's call and relentless creativity and innovation. They had to create their own educational systems. Pastoral training was often based on memorization. They found ways to meet the needs of their communities when they themselves had little. They met in sheds and tents. The pastors were bivocational. There's so much more to be told here, but in 25 years, AME had grown to 450,000 members, a 22-fold increase. The growth of Christianity in African American communities is still perhaps the most significant revival in American history, but no one called it revival then. They just called it following Jesus. So we need to triple the number of new churches each year in America right now to meet the needs of the lost and counteract the massive waves of older church closures in urban areas expected over the next 2 to 3 decades. Where are our circuit riders? Why aren't we using more technology to make it easier to start faithful churches and train people as they go? What can we do to recruit more church planters from the communities that need them? How can every church in this room start another church with local leadership in the next 3 years? I don't have answers to all those questions, but I believe God and you do. Do you hear me, my friends? We are sitting in front of the greatest gospel moment in history, and we act at times as if somehow revival is just going to drop down from heaven on a golden parachute. Of course, God will move mightily and powerfully through his Spirit. But God makes it clear that he calls us to labor with him and gives us the agency to advance his kingdom if we will follow. There are many faithful laborers for the gospel in America, and we have a room full of them here today. But our good work is not good enough in light of this moment. I could give so many more examples from church history, and if you want to read more, read the report or the books mentioned in the bibliography. Graham, Whitefield, Luther, and dozens more were all relentless in doing the long, hard work of writing, preaching, evangelizing, discipling, and starting churches and ministries. There is much more we must do, and we cannot bear to hear them all now. But let me stress, we must restructure our priorities to focus on young people and lower the barriers to starting and running churches, among other strategies. But what do I know? I'm some random guy from the land of fleece and coffee. What does Scripture say? Almost every time I speak on this moment, I close with the same Scripture because it takes us hearing the same message over and over to internalize it. Jesus knew that. He gives the same illustration at different times in Matthew 16 and Luke 12. And in both cases, he is angry at religious leaders for not responding to his call. Jesus said to the crowds, "You see a cloud rising in the west and you say at once a shower is coming. And so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, there will be scorching heat. And it happens. You hypocrites! You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time?" We are privileged at this moment to discern the probable departure of tens of millions of our children and grandchildren, our friends and family, away from a life with Jesus. And if statistics hold true, it will be a lasting loss for generations to come. If we look at our churches, our communities, our families, the signs are obvious to all. It doesn't have to be this way. We can see the greatest opportunity for the gospel actually become the greatest revival in American history if we are willing to prayerfully do the long, hard work in new and different ways. May it be, O Lord.